Mehdi, welcome to the Way of Champions, man. It's great to have you on and a very successful champion coach at this past Paris Olympics.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, we were just talking before we started, and you're with Ineos Cycling now in muddy, wet Spain, which we don't usually use those adjectives for our winter Spanish training camps, but it is,
Yeah,
isn't
here
it?
we are. Yeah, in I think we're in South. Well, we are in southeast Spain. It has been sunny, just not very warm. And yeah, it was raining, as we say in England, cats and dogs today and yesterday.
Yeah. Well, I want you to, we haven't really had too many people in the cycling space in 400 plus episodes of this podcast. So I'm super excited to have you on because I'm a passionate and a not very good mountain biker, but a passionate one. And, I just think it's such a fascinating sport. And what I was most interested to hear about was sort of how you got into it, because here you are, coaching Olympic cycling, but you were never like a cycling, like a racer yourself.
No, I wear it almost as a badge of honor now, John, in terms of I've never ever ridden a competitive bike race at any discipline. So my hometown is Cambridge, which Cambridge, England, not
Hmm.
Cambridge, where the main form of transport is cycling. So while I've
Hmm.
got good bike handling skills, I've always kind of viewed it up until I started my career in cycling as a mode of transport
Hmm.
rather than so I never was anchored to the sport itself. Like I don't, look at a track cyclist and think, that's something I was or need to be.
Hmm.
I actually like coaching for having the skin in the game, the dog in the fight, as we say, and just I just love performance. I love people being the best version of themselves or as close as they can be
Hmm.
when the highest.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. Now, you even had like a background with your PhD and everything, working with in like was it the British space program or something like that?
Oh no, no. So what happened? I guess for yourself. I never was a professional athlete,
Yeah,
and I did a sports science degree or had a background in that. It was only my PhD, so I had a bit of a convoluted career. So I started off as an accountant. I
yeah,
tried to pick university, and I failed the exams pretty quickly, like the equivalent of your 5 meter swim badge. I
yeah.
failed that. And then eventually, like my dad just said, "Just do something you're passionate about. At least you want to do it."
Uh-huh.
That's still, what do I like? At the time, I was a kind of an amateur rower trying to get onto the GB team, which I never got anywhere near. But I was always like, you know what? I've always been interested in trying to improve my performance through different modes of training, but there's only one modality or status quo of the training that they would prescribe. But anyway, that's back in my head, and I did my master's in aerospace and aviation physiology, and then
Mm.
that led me to Brazil to do a project there, Peru, and then I went to work for the European Space Agency in the European Astronaut Center in Cologne, Germany. So I
Yeah,
worked there for 18 months, and from there I got a PhD in essentially the training sciences of sprint cycling
yeah.
at the English Institute of Sport, British Cycling, and Northumbria University, but it was based in the Velodrome in Manchester, where I
Hmm.
am now.
Yeah. Yeah. And then so you got into cycling and working with Team GB, which was obviously a heavily invested cycling team for the 2012 Olympics, and then after that, successful in Tour de France and all that sort of stuff. What was that experience like? Because obviously that team is had some tremendous riders and tremendous success.
Yeah, so when I first got in, it was 2013, so it was just off the back of London and Bradley Wiggins being the first Brit to win the Tour de France. So
Yeah.
cycling was inside, and I was actually quite intimidated because, it had this aura or mystique about it of being able to churn out cyclists. Apparently it was open to science and progression and out the box thinking. So when I first got there, it was quite intimidating. I didn't want to annoy anyone or say the wrong thing. And you're told that these coaches are quite, they've been very, very successful at the Olympics, and you can learn from them. So I didn't really know what to do or say.
Hmm.
Um, However, I was just kind of wide-eyed and kind of almost in awe of what was going on, and just trying to figure out what was going on.
Hmm.
Uh, but it was almost like going to British cycling is that if you want to compare it to commerce or industry, is the equivalent of Google or Apple in terms of money and stature. They've
Yeah,
got like 4 or 5 times the amount of more money in funding per Olympic cycle than any other federation. So
right.
they are well advanced in investment in different aspects of the performance.
Yeah, and I heard you, I've heard other interviews with you talking about that, where that, obviously David Brailsford and Sir David, I guess now, and everything, this idea of like marginal gains. And the more money you have, the more marginal things you can invest in, right? So, like things like wind tunnels and suits and mattresses and pillows and I think it's interesting. It's an interesting concept because like at the top level of sport, right? Where are all the, you find your 1% here and your 0.5% here. But I think the top level of sport also misses out on a big area for gains, which is sort of the inner game, the psychology of success. So, you see these professional sports teams, not just in cycling, invest in all the data analytics and all the sports scientists, but they don't have a sports psychologist on staff. And that always amazes me. So talk about that. Like, what was your role with British cycling, and what did you do? And this concept of marginal gains, because our listeners are coaches and they're coaching high schools and clubs and universities and some professional teams, but they don't have big budgets. They don't have things.
Yeah.
They don't have the ability to invest in the metaphorical wind tunnel, if you will.
So what I'll do, I'll tell you what it was like, and I'll
Yeah,
tell you my outlook of it in the end.
yeah.
So I was part of the marginal gains, overarching philosophy. I was a PhD, so I
Hmm.
wasn't, was I needed? No. Would it affect the day-to-day function of the team and training? Not instantly. So it would take, 3 or 4 years. So they invested in that, in some R&D and a PhD. So that was, the idea is that will help improve training by 1%. And then, with everything else putting together, will make um, a margin that's way greater than everyone else when you
Right.
add more together. However, like just to give the readers a bit of context as well. So I started with a PhD student, then I became the physiologist or the sports scientist for the paracycling team, and then I
Hmm.
became a coach for the paracycling team. The reason why I became a coach was because I wanted to have the responsibility and accountability. I had all these crazy ideas and from my studies, but I wanted to. A lot of coaches were saying, it's not your head on the chopping block, it's mine. So I thought, I'll take the responsibility. Then from there, I kind of hit a glass ceiling after we got kind of really good success with the tandem riders. So with a visually
Hmm.
impaired person on the back and an able person on the front.
Hmm.
But then, I thought I hit my glass ceiling. I tried to move into the Olympic space with the able body to try and share my ideas. Did have more efficacy because there's an argument that I was given to that the para sport domain hasn't got much breadth or depth. So then I went to a startup basically, which is called, they were called the People's Republic of Barbados. So it's a team in Derby.
Hmm.
And really, and then from there I went to the Dutch, and their budgets were a fraction of. I mean, go into the detail in a minute, but essentially, I was quoting the paper, the Times, with saying marginal gains are dead, and I really do believe they are dead. I think
Hmm.
going back into the Moneyball era, where you had data and you could make all these data-driven choices at that time, was a really good way of bringing sports into the modern age.
Hmm.
But to achieve marginal gains, it requires large budgets and management and experts, which is time, resource, and have to sort of process, which all one person or 2 or 3 people can't do. My overarch, and I can't think of a fancy name for it. I think let's call it major gains. Is for me as an overriding principle as a coach, and where I got most of my success was getting a priority of going, where am I going to get my biggest bang for the buck, or where is the juice worth the squeeze? Where am I going to put my investment to get a
Hmm.
disproportionate beneficial return? So,
Yeah.
for example, from a technological perspective, skin suits can, the best and worst skin suit can account for 10% of performance, which is a country mile.
Yeah.
So, rather than going into little sort of details like a chain or a sprocket that would, I couldn't even measure the needle being moved,
Right.
all on the skin suit and the overshoes for the Dutch to make
Yeah.
sure that we had our biggest bang for our buck and made sure that all the effort I was putting in, all the juice I was squeezing was worth it.
Yeah. I love that. I mean, there was a book I read a couple years ago, and I'm spacing the name of the author, but the title of the book was Less But Better, right? And the idea was like focus on less things, but the most important things and do them better. And I think this concept of marginal gains got so much traction that again, you're focusing on the metaphorical sprocket, which is 0.01% of performance, and not focusing on the bigger pillars, right? I'm being a soccer coach or a football coach, right? It's like we always break it up into four areas, right? And I would go and do coaching licensing, and they would talk about technical development and tactical and physical and psychological. But they would break it up in four ways, but no one would ever talk about the psychological piece. So you'd spend all your time in the technical and the tactical, and then a little bit of the physical, right? But no one would talk about here. And so, I always think about like that's a less but better space, right? Where some focus there can have a much, it's like the skin suit. That's a 10% thing, not a 0.01% thing, which I think is really critical.
Yeah, it is, and you make a really interesting point there. Like I've examined a lot of sports, and I'm interested in a lot of sports. So, like I said, I'm not anchored to cycling per se. Um, and of every coaching course I know of, there's nothing with emotional intelligence
No.
or social dynamic. And I think when we are going data driven, and in cycling, just for your reference and the audiences, you can measure everything, and I mean everything. So
Yeah.
power, torque, cadence, your angle, speed, rolling resistance, aerodynamic. You can measure it until you're blue in the face to the point where you get paralysis through analysis. There are so many sort of metrics and things you can write and sort of digest. In the end, doing this data-driven approach was counteractive. And what I meant by that is, why were we looking at numbers when we didn't actually know the meaning of them or actually monitor them? So in cycling, in sprint cycling, the track, if you just enter, if your entry speed before you start your effort, if you're moving, is higher, you're going to get there's a 98% influence of the final time. So in other
Hmm.
words, if you want to go faster in your training effort, you just enter faster. The
Hmm.
end. It's that
Hmm.
simple. So why are we monitoring power, gears, cadence when all we know is just like if unless we can match the entry speed, which is
Hmm.
almost impossible, it
Hmm.
means nothing. So in the end, we just focused on standing start data because we knew it was from a stationary start, it was easily comparable.
Hmm.
And what else? The next part, or the thing I focused in most, and for that, that major gain or focusing thing on more was the psychological aspect, or I like to call it the emotional and social aspect.
Yeah.
So understanding your riders or athletes is way more important than a tactical or technical thing. I really believe that the difference between coaches, and everyone always refers to the tactics and the technical aspect of a coach. Usually that's quite it's so hard to control that because of the chaos of any sport that the tactical technical stuff can get the minor details. The thing that you really can really get your biggest gain, if you want to call it that, is having that connection, that emotional and understanding of the social dynamic in the team to get the best out of them. In other words, if they trust you and believe the words that are coming out of your mouth, that's way better than giving them the best tactical session you ever know
Yeah.
or give them. And what I did in what I thought was really good, I had 30-minute meetings with these athletes every week.
Yeah.
And that was brilliant because you get to know how they think, you get to know the temperature of the team, the culture, and all that stuff. So um, I really think that the psychological, as you call it, but I'm going more specific in the emotional and the social aspect of
Yeah.
it, is really neglected in any coaching course.
Yeah. And I think part of it is because it's hard to measure, right? So it's very easy to, in a coaching course, to measure, does this person know enough about physiology, right? But how do I measure my psychological, my social, emotional impact on an athlete? It's measurable, but it's much harder to measure, right? In a environment like a coaching course for sure, but even in the real world where I can say, oh, we've done this many reps of this. And I think what happens is we tend to value the things that we can measure because sometimes it's hard to measure the things that we really value. And I think like I'll remember years ago I did a talk for a ski racing organization, one of the top ones in the US. And the other speaker that day was a guy named Christian Mitter, and he was the coach of the Norwegian men's alpine team. And at that time, they were the best in the world. They were killing everyone. And he showed this amazing video of one of their top racers preparing to come and ski again in Beaver Creek, Colorado, on the course that the year before, going off this huge air, he had crashed and broken his leg on. Now, there was nothing there. Yes, there's technical about your line and how you're approaching that and your preparation, but his whole preparation for that race was getting over the fact that right before the finish line, there's an 80-foot air that I almost killed myself on last year, right? And if you ignore that, that's what he's carrying with him the whole way down the hill. Not how am I going to edge this or whatever, but like, God, I almost died last year here. And if you're not coaching that, if you're not creating the environment for him to get that, then it's doesn't the other stuff like you said doesn't matter.
And you can't connect with that athlete and using that example unless you know him or her.
Yeah,
In terms of like, if you're going to give him the hairdryer, as we say in
yeah,
England, like really sort of stick it to him. You better be sure that that's the right reaction you're going to elicit. It could go the other way and be like, oh, I don't. What's this guy talking about? I'm never going to do what he says or anything like that. So I think it's the psychological, emotional, and social aspect is really important and thing that's neglected. And maybe you're right. Maybe it's because you can't measure it. Maybe because you can't stick a number in it. Maybe because I find it odd because like we're trying to measure everything like our sleep,
yeah,
and I'm not against Oura rings or Whoops or smartwatches, but you don't need one of them to tell you you've had a bad night's sleep. You've had 40 years experience of having bad night's sleeps or not. So
yeah,
you can wake up and go, I haven't slept well. I'm gonna have an early night. You don't need a number. And as a coach, you know your athletes well enough to be like, hey, something's wrong. Like you don't look well. Is everything all right?
yeah.
Um, and that's way cheaper and easier than an Oura ring.
How do you measure? I had a fight with my wife right before training today, right? Like that's because that's going to affect training, right? That's going to affect whatever. And so, your what you say is so important. I want to unpack this from a coaching standpoint because of all the coaches that we've had on here, some of whom have coached the greatest athletes in their sport. They all are 100% consistent that coaching is about relationships. That winning the relationship game is the most important thing that you do, right? That if you do that, if you're good at that, then everything else follows. Now, when you walk into a professional locker room, you have to have knowledge of the sport. Of course, that matters, right? Or there's no respect, but that knowledge, without the relationship, eventually players, athletes, they're like, well, who cares? He's not in it for me, or he doesn't care about me, or he doesn't know me. So what you said and your 30-minute weekly meetings, this is the other consistent thing. What's the most powerful coaching tool? Individual meetings over and over and over individual meetings. And it was really interesting. There's just a top coach in soccer right now internationally. And I was just reading about him who says he doesn't believe in individual meetings with his team. Only his assistant coaches do that. And I'm like, man, this goes against everything that I've heard about from people who have coached Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant or Steph Curry or people like that.
Yeah, I guess without knowing the context or anything, I guess that's a protection mechanism for him. He has to drop players and he has to tell them, that they're not going to play. And I just want to unpack something as well. You talk about the relationship. People think having a good relationship means you're friends.
Right.
You don't have to be friends. You just have to be there. You have to have a trusting bond, let's call it that.
Can you
And you have to
define
have
trust?
trust. Willing. Yeah, really good question, actually, John. Let me try and do it on the fly. Trust is a feeling or a sensation towards someone where you believe or, yeah, where you believe what they say or do, or believe in what they say or do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've just done it on the fly. I definitely think it's a feeling or an innate feeling that you can't quantify it, but it's more of a bond. that has a certain understanding where there is a belief and certainty amongst it,
Yeah.
or your understanding.
That was good. That was good on the fly. Because I think about this a lot, right? And there's whole books on trust, right? So to give the elevator what is trust is never enough. But I heard someone define it recently, which I liked, is, trust is my ability to predict how you're going to react in a certain situation as well,
That's good.
right?
That's
So
strong.
today, if I have a bad day and you're like, "Hey, it's okay, whatever," and then tomorrow, if you give me the hair dryer, I don't trust you because I don't know how you're going to react in that situation, right? If you're at the top level of sport, today it's quiet and tomorrow you throw me under the bus in front of the media, how can I trust you, right? And so I think that's part of it as well. And again, trust isn't just about knowledge, it's about predictability and believability and connection, that I know you're in it for me and I can predict how you're going to behave, then I'm probably going to trust you.
It's interesting you say that actually, because consistency is probably a big thing as well, and
Yeah.
predictability. There are some people who are very unpredictable that you do have, maybe that they're going to be unpredictable. Um, yeah, that's a fascinating definition. I think, it's definitely trust is always earned. Again, how do you earn trust? I think,
Hmm.
from a sporting standpoint, if you go into a dressing room for the first time, you do have to show them that you have technical competency first and foremost,
Hmm.
because they're going to go, okay, what am I doing, or what are we doing wrong? So you have to have some
Right.
sort of
There's got
idea.
to be a plan.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and I think it's called philosophy now in sport, a
Sure.
philosophy or old school plan. But I think after that, once you know, tactics get figured out, motivation wanes, and the same message comes. The way you can, again, elevate that person, yeah, you have that connection with them, where you know what you're going to get, but you know what's expected of you, and yeah, it's that. It's that when you hear that those players say, "I'll run through a wall for that person." It's almost like, not necessarily their best. Yeah, I guess I'm really waffling here, but I guess trust is like having known that whatever your action is, it's for their best intention or for the greater good or for the overall good. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think, and so what is that based in? I would use the word, and Jerry and I talk about a lot, like love, right? So my love
Mm.
for you, right? And again, I think we think of this love like, you know, family. Doesn't mean I like you in every moment, but I can still love you, you know, and that love means I have your best interest in mind as we're doing this. I'm predictable, I'm consistent, I'm believable. And I know as an athlete that what you're telling me is designed to help me be my very best, right? And that kind of is what brings it together on an individual, but also as a team, right? As a team, like I know in team cycling and track cycling, like you're working on, right? Like one of the things that I read about you and where was a place that you could find gains in track cycling was like um, aerodynamics, and so how closely a team can ride together. Well, if I'm riding at that speed right on someone's wheel with an inch apart, I have to trust you. Like we unpacked this discussion with a guy named Ryan Bernacchi here. He was the head of the Blue Angels, the flying thing, right? So there
Mhm.
you are flying hundreds of miles an hour, and your wings are 16 inches apart. I better trust that you know when we're turning, how far we're turning, or we're all dead. You know?
I it, I just want to sort of touch on something you just said about the love.
Yeah.
So we finished the Olympics this year, where it was announced that I was leaving the team anyway, the Dutch team that is. And we had the most successful Olympic Games. We won the medals table, three golds, a silver and a bronze. But I think I had a lot of trouble processing it afterwards, because people kept saying, like, sport is transactional.
Mm.
They're not going to miss you. And it's true, they're not, because they are athletes. Their careers are short, and they need what's best for them. In other words, It's like the king is dead, long live the king. You know,
Yeah.
Mehdi's gone.
They have
Who's
to
the
move
next?
on.
Yeah, will is really sad, but who's next? When's the next guy coming in? Because we need our next coach. Whereas for me, it was like, that was it. I met the king of the Netherlands. I got on a plane and that was it. And I had this, it was almost said like, well, what are you expecting? You should have a transactional relationship with them. But it took a lot of processing and thought over about 6 weeks where I actually admitted to myself, and I'm not shy or ashamed to say now that I had an emotional connection with them. I had a transformational connection with them. I got a kick out of them doing well. I cared for them. I loved for them.
Mm,
Um, and when I went to the toilet in the middle of the night, I have two kids and a wife. In Manchester, when I'm going back and forth to coach the Dutch, I thought about them as well as much as my family in terms of how am I going to get them better and what's keeping them up at night. Why are they not performing well? So, I think, for any person listening out there, if you have an emotional connection where you feel a bit empty after you've been gone or been moved on or whatever it is, that is okay. That
mhm.
that's nothing to be ashamed of, and nothing that you shouldn't act all tough and say that, yeah, I've moved on too, and be defiant. If you have that emotional bond, process it.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And again, in professional sport, right? There is a transactional nature to it, right? And you can love your people and then also, let them go. I mean, Alex Ferguson was, you know, I love you and I care about you and but I had to let David Beckham go or I had to let a Roy Keane go. And yes, that strained that relationship. It didn't, I loved him, but it wasn't, for the best of the team and everyone else. I have to make a hard decision here. And I think so I think there's that part of it that I think someone who is a professional athlete has to also understand, on the grassroots level, on the sport for development level, I think you're also moving players on. They're moving to an older age group. They're passing through. You're only going to have them for a couple of years, and showing them that leadership is about vulnerability and humility and love and caring for your people is probably the best lesson you can give them more than any performance lesson.
And I think there should be something in the psychological model that, it's not, it's the most like hard to define relationship because it is transactional to a certain extent, but it's also transformational.
Mm.
So I'll be very curious to know if any kind of psychologist could look into that.
Well, it's interesting. Many years ago before he passed away, John Wooden was asked to sort of do, he has his famous pyramid of success for his athletes, right? And then they asked him to do a book on sort of the pyramid of coaching success. And the cornerstone, the base of it was love. And he said it was love. And then they approached him and said, we don't want to use that word love in coaching, kind of whatever. And he said, well, if you don't want to use the word love, take my name off the book because I'm not interested because that's where it all comes from. And I think this is just so important that coaches have to have the courage to do this. And again, not in a creepy way, right? But just love your athletes. And sometimes the best way you love someone is moving them on and saying this isn't for you. This is you're not willing to meet the standard, so we got to move on.
I think when we using love in this context, it's like love meaning you want the best for them you're the team you're coaching.
Yeah,
It's you I yeah, it's just you just want the best of them. Now the best of them might not be for your team. It might not be um yeah, you might not be the best person for them either. But
yeah.
ultimately, if you have the best intention and can express that good intention in an action, then that's all you can do. But I think, with coaching it, you can in heated moments, take your eye off that and you can get over passionate and
Well, sometimes as a coach, the way you love your team is you say you're ready for a new coach too, right?
Mm.
Like I know in my personal 30 years of coaching, I kind of would have when I would coach, kids, teenagers, a 3-year cycle, right? After 3 years, the you know I felt like the learning had slowed down. My ability to keep connecting, my joy of the newness of it would wear off, and my frustration with bad habits that hadn't gotten fixed would would take over that. And it was less enjoyable for me, and I think it was less enjoyable for them. So I kind of knew, hey, I have a kind of a 3 year cycle, and then I got to hand you off to someone else. Even when you're like, oh no, coach, please stay. Like, no, it's good for you to experience someone else, and it's good for me to experience someone else, because they're people, right? And I think this is one of the issues going back to the data side of things, right? Like people are messy, right?
Oh yeah.
People, they're
Yeah.
not, and we sometimes treat kids like robots where we just need to program in the data, the technical, tactical stuff, and then they're going to perform. But people are messy.
Messy, they got baggage, and present company included.
Yeah.
We've all got, and I think the hardest thing, or the most naive thing I did as a coach was think, why can't I just looking through my own lens? And I think that there's that inconvenient paradox of coach and star performer. Like, to perform, you have to be quite selfish. You have to get
Hmm.
your, you have to have your nutrition. You have to prepare. Whereas, being a coach, you have to think about everyone else, and that's exhausting as well. That takes a lot of energy because you have to look after yourself, but that's really hard to do when you're trying to make sure everyone else is trying to be the best version of themselves. So I yeah, I just think it's we people don't understand how messy humans are until you get into leadership and coaching,
Yeah.
and then it's so messy. And I think you made a really nice point there, John, which I think not people a lot of people are scared to say that. You know what? We look at the greats, whatever whoever it might be, like Alex Ferguson or Phil Jackson or whoever, and they last for long periods of time. And it's okay to say that, I've got a shelf life. Probably more for myself. I was there with the Dutch for 6 years.
Hmm.
It was like, as much as my ego wanted to stay longer or anything like that, like, it was the perfect time for me to, like, they needed a new voice. I was running out of ideas. I was running out of steam. Like, they were getting the same voice. 6 years is an eternity in sport.
Yeah.
And I think years, there's nothing wrong saying, hey guys, like, I'm a 3 year project.
Yeah.
After that, you probably need to find someone else. And I think that's a great, refreshing kind of viewpoint on self-reflection on yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And so like before this Paris Olympics, you knew you were leaving and your athletes knew that too?
Yeah, it was, there was a debate whether we should or shouldn't. Like, in the end, I'm a bad liar. I'm quite a transparent person, so I just said, "Look, guys, I'm leaving." And you know what? You expect that people to be wailing, crying, and saying, "Oh, please don't give us so much success," and we're going in such a good direction. But everyone was like, "Cool, you got to do
Yeah.
what's best for you." And someone said, very nice, and very nice messages at the end and stuff. But you know, they, you're quote unquote just their coach, and there's another one coming in. And the first question was, who's do you have someone lined up to replace you?
Yeah.
Um, there's a kick for your ego, but that's just the reality of it. And it's I'm happy it ended up like that.
And certainly with Olympics and world championships in a sport like that, like there's a natural end to the cycle versus a baseball manager or a soccer manager where the season sort of is always churning and whatever. Yes, I might like to leave at the end of the season, but not many managers choose to do that. They're, the choice is made for them when they're going to leave when the performance isn't good enough for whatever. So like, how do you when you come in, like, so you come in from British cycling, you go to Dutch cycling. How do you get buy-in to new ideas? How do you convince people? Convince is probably the wrong word. How do you get them to say, okay, this is a different voice with maybe some different ideas, but they're in it for me? Like, how do you go about that process? Because I think this goes back to trust. And I always think of trust as like you need to make deposits in the bank before you make withdrawals. And a lot of
Mm.
people come in and start making withdrawals and then wonder why it's not working.
A really good question. I've had a lot of reflection on that recently because I've just started my new job, and I think when I look back on it now, there was a lot of initial frustration because what I didn't want to do is upset the apple cart. And what I mean by that is I actually was hired as a scientist and a coach. So I was doing kind of both jobs, and there was a head coach. at the time, and he was very much saying, don't talk to an athlete, don't tell them anything, stand apart. So it was very much
Did
like
he hire you or did the Federation hire you?
he hired me, but I think he had some success before I came, so he wanted
Yeah,
to just keep the keep the
keep it going.
formula.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was very selective success, but success is success. And that just really annoyed me because I was like, I want to make an impact, I want to make an impact, I want to make an impact. But ultimately, I just got to observe. And then, in the end, I thought, I think I do want to contribute. So I just got to know the athletes. If I'm a coach, why shouldn't I get to know the athletes?
Hmm.
And it was the ones that were the less successful ones at the time who were getting the least attention. I thought, you know what, we could change something here, and that's where I put my focus on what I could change rather than what I couldn't. And
Hmm.
we've all heard the expression "control the controllables," which I
Hmm.
think is a survival mechanism.
Hmm.
And from that point of view, that's what I was doing. I was only working with not out of spite or anything, but I knew I wasn't going to get any buy-in from a already someone who's won and someone who the coach wants to work with and doesn't want me working with. So I
Hmm.
worked with other people, and it ended up being really good that we won an Olympic gold medalist out of it, out of someone who's never won a race before, by just what we talked about earlier. So it was more about if you can try and bide your time, try and get to know them a bit, and eventually someone will come to you and ask you something because that's a new curious nature. But going to how would that apply if I could do it all again? I would just don't sweat on the people who aren't coming with you. Go for the people who will come with you, and
Yeah.
once they see success, more and more people will buy into you.
Yeah. I always like this idea in cultures and obviously the numbers are not exact, but sort of the 10-80-10 rule that like 10% of people are with you 100% all the time, show up early, stay late, do the extra, whatever. They're the joy, right? And 10% of the people are at the bottom who drive you crazy. And sometimes this is your most talented people, but they don't show up. They're late, they're not bought in, they're selfish, whatever it is. But most people are in the middle, right? They're in that 80 and some days they're there and some days they're not. And we as coaches tend to sweat that bottom 10% and you spend all your emotional energy and time on them. Whereas if we could get some of those 80, if we can turn that top 10 into a top 20 or a top 30, go those people who show up once in a while and get them to do more and intentionally do that, then we also create an environment where it's not comfortable to be the bottom 10, where it's not
Mm.
comfortable to be the person who doesn't want to listen or doesn't buy in because everyone else is doing it. And so I can keep doing this and not being successful, or I can kind of buy in. And I found that this has worked for me and the coaches that I work with and the players that I work with. Like I'll ask a team, a university team, who's in the 80? Who's a person that if we got her or we got him to just be switched on more, to perform a little better more often, it would make the biggest difference for our team. And almost every team can name that person. And they're like, all right, let's go after him. Mehdi, for the next 2 weeks, that's your job. Right. And in 2 weeks, we'll meet again. And if you're like, hey, it's not working. Like there is no connection there. We'll find someone else. But what I don't want to do in 2 weeks is be like, okay, well, who reached out to her? Who had an extra conversation? Who teamed with her in training and no one raised their hand? Well, we just wasted 2 weeks. So intentionally assigning people to drag people along really tends to work well to get more people to buy in who are willing to buy in once in a while, but not all the time.
There's a phrase I heard once, was you only have to be right once. And then that builds momentum. And in sport, as you know, John, momentum is
Yeah.
infectious, good or bad.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's usually yeah, trying to get that win, trying to get people on board, and just riding that crest. And obviously, if it's going the other way, stop the bleeding
Yeah.
and try to have a reset.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. Yeah. Momentum's can be the best thing or it can be the scariest thing
Yeah.
as well. Yeah. So, like, one of the things I know you were originally with the Dutch, just working with the women, correct?
At the first, yeah, and then I kind of ended up with Bowden being the head coach. Yeah.
And I heard you say like they were following the same program as the men were, and certainly we have a lot more in the sports science realm now coming about how, right? women need different training methodologies and planning, and what happens to women during puberty is very different than what happens to men during puberty in terms of performance and plateaus and things like that. So that was one of the big things you changed right out of the gate, was like different program for the women.
Yeah, I think the observation was that I mean it was quite a rigid structure at the time. So it was Monday to Friday, weekends off, and everyone would do exactly the same training all the time. Um, and I'm not belittling that. That gives stability, that gives structure, that gives predictability. Which is all the found and they ticked all the foundation stones, but there was very poor periodization
Hmm.
and a very poor appreciation of the women.
Yeah.
So while the men can hammer it out 5 days in a row, what I found, at least in track cycle, I don't know if that's reminiscent or similar to any other sport, men could really go hard on one or two efforts or three efforts or whatever, and they'd be cooked
Yeah.
because they'd be able to go so deep. The women could do more efforts and not go so deep. So, I just added more volume because, that's a training stimulus because, we weren't going to, why should we just do what the men were doing? Because they were getting the training stimulus they need, but the women weren't. Also, as well, like, I mean, this is very basic biology, physiology, is women have estrogen, men have testosterone. So
Hmm.
in track cycling, which is a power sport, strength and power sport, you don't hold on to your muscle for as long as if you're a woman than you are with a man. So we had more strength stimulus and more strength sessions than bike ones at certain periods of the time. So it was very much again, getting to know your athlete, like, at first it was a superficial observation in terms of like, the training, execution, and also getting to know, okay, these are women. Okay, what's different about women to men? Why isn't this working? It could be this. Let's start with this. And, it caught fire to the point where, like I said, we had two athletes going to the games who had some, well, one crashed out, which was a shame because I'd love to see how she concluded, but the other one ended up in quite a compelling gold medal after not winning a world championship medal and having a heart attack 5 years before.
Oof.
So it's
Yeah.
it's quite the turnaround. It's a great success and fairy tale story, and we had something similar as well in Paris where we got a silver out of nothing as well. So, but I mean nothing. I mean results previously they were building, but they'll never.
There's no previous results that would say this person's going to win a gold or a silver. Yeah.
I mean, she was coming, but she was
Yeah.
never winning.
Yeah.
And then she's won now, I think, three or four world medals and Olympic
Mm.
medals. So it all just comes back to, a bit of coaching in terms of common sense and combining knowledge that's already out there.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit, because this is certainly with your PhD, in this idea of training stimulus? I mean, certainly in North America, across a variety of sports, what is really one of the biggest issues is that players never recover, so they never go 100%, right? They never have the super intense day because they never have the recovery day. And there's this sort of myth of gotta get up, gotta grind every single day, that I think is detrimental, because from a stimulus perspective, and granted every sport is different, but growth comes from those hard days and then recovering from those hard days and then being able to go hard again. And in sports like soccer, or I think youth hockey now, and basketball, these kids play so many games that they never recover. And so they're playing slowly, um, because they're never going 100% because they've never recovered from the hard day.
Yeah. Uh, I think I should quantify recovery
Yeah.
as mental and emotional as well.
Yeah.
So people think it's physical, but playing a 90-minute game if you want to play football or soccer is intense, and you have to run and run and run, and particularly if it's going to extra time or it's a really tight game, and the intensity's there, and the intensity's been higher than it's ever been in terms of like even at the in the lower leagues, but there is a people forget that how much it takes out of you emotionally. If you're playing under floodlights, you're overstimulated with lights, with noise. You're using, I mean, probably not kids, but there's lots of supplementation like caffeine
Hmm.
and everything else that people don't get to sleep till about 3, 4 a.m. the next, the after the game.
Hmm.
It's really poor compromise sleep as well. So
Yeah.
I think I do believe in recovery, but also the emotional and I don't keep banging on about emotional and that sort of, but it's we're humans and things can take it out of you, to really have a really big game. You have to get yourself up for it.
Mhm.
Now, like, don't get me wrong, in this English Premier League, there's 38 games a season. You have the FA Cup. You can have up to 60 games some seasons.
Mhm.
That is hard if you're doing all 60 games. And I'm not trying to say that about load management, but
Mhm.
getting yourself up like mentally for 60 games in a period of 7 or 8 months is hard. It's
Yeah.
really hard. Yeah. So it's I do believe in recovery, but I think it's more about the emotional and mental side of it. I think the
And
physical one you can train, but
you
yeah,
can
it's
train that. I mean, but I think that's really interesting also, like, you know, the Manchester Derby, or Merseyside Derby, Liverpool and Everton. You don't have to get your players up as a coach for that game,
no.
right? That's happening, right? But where you might have to get them up is we're playing Brentford on Sunday and Barcelona on Wednesday in the Champions League. We got to focus on Sunday. Wednesday is going to take care of itself. And I think that's the role of the coach, is understanding how do I get the desired hunger and effort on those days, because I know certain days is going to take care of
My
itself.
theory is like, and I've been in this trap. You don't like, the theory, or if we're talking about it in a bar or on a podcast like we are now,
Mhm.
we're like, "Man, why don't you rest some of your better players, or give them half a game or something, like put them on the bench if you need them." But in sport, it's so win now or you're out
Yeah.
culture. As a coach, all I care about is the next game or race. If I
Yeah.
don't win that, I have a saying like you're under siege or it's coming. So
Yeah.
you have to put your full strength side out every single time because
Yeah.
all you care about is like if I start losing 2 games, all of a sudden my neck's on a chopping block and people are asking questions. So it's I do think it's the higher fi nature of the sport. And I think if it was more stable, it wouldn't be like that, and you could sort of rest more players and people be up for it. But you see it all the time in these things, like an FA Cup tie, to a team in the lower division, and they get turned over because they put their reserve players who aren't fit, don't really want to be there. It's a cold day in England, which has very many cold days, by the way.
Yeah.
Get turned over, and it's the same in sport as well. If we have to go to the other side of the world to do 1 or 2 races, no one really wants to be there. It's kind of like we have to do it to qualify for the Olympics. But yeah, as a coach, I'm putting my best riders on that line
Yeah.
because I think it's a chance of winning.
Yeah. No, and it's really hard, right? Because, again, you can't listen to the pundits or the media, because if you're that coach and you don't give other people a try and they say, well, this was the game to give your people, a run out and you didn't do it. And then if you lose, they say, well, why didn't you play your best team? So the coach is in a no-win situation in those moments.
It's quite
And
literally a no-win situation. If he doesn't win, he's out. So
and if he doesn't win,
it's
he's out. And I mean, I,
yeah.
I would say that in probably world soccer is the most dynamic in and out. You got a bad month, you're out, right?
Mm.
And I would say there's probably no coach more secure in his job than Pep Guardiola at Man City, and yet he's had this terrible run now where they've lost 7 out of 8 games and lost again, just yesterday to Juventus. And it's like, and people are like, wow, is he going to make it? Is he going to make it to the end of the season or whatever? Is he out of
In the
ideas?
British media, it has not been even discussed.
Yeah,
Like him losing his job, which
yeah.
is the only person in modern memory I know who's lost 7 out of 8 games, and no one's really calling for his head.
No one's calling for his head, but if he loses two more, will they be? Will they say he's lost the locker room? Will they say it's whatever? And it's like, it's just it's an amazing thing, because it's very hard. All these things that we talk about, trust, love, culture, are long-term things that we have to try to create in a short-term win now environment. That's the challenge with coaching at the highest level, you know,
Mm.
to get your people in and create these things so that this player can have a bad game and still show up and play the next day. I mean, it's sort of like, you know like Major League Baseball, there's 162 games, and it's like you're going to win a third and lose a third, and whatever you do with the other third is going to determine whether you have a good season or not, you know? And so there's a lot less, we lost today. We move on because we get to play again tomorrow. Whereas in American football or soccer, there's this period of time between where everyone gets to, you know, create doubt.
Mm. It, and I just want to sort of say that I think on the optics of it all, people look at Pep Guardiola and go, look, he's had the best players in the world and now he's doing rubbish. And, you know, I think you shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is for him or has been for him in general. I think people just think, oh, he's just got the best players. Do not underestimate the egos of those players. And yes, he moves them on quickly, but, it's, yeah, I mean, he probably can't do it in the lower leagues, but he's not a lower league coach. He's that sort
Right.
of person. I think that, how he's had this run for this long has been unprecedented. So the fact that he's losing now is, it's for the laws of probability, it should have happened pretty much now.
Well, I also think, I mean, it's interesting, right? How important certain players are. And obviously, Rodri, who got injured, just won World Player of the Year, and there was controversy around, why did he win it? Well, look at their record since he went out versus look at their record when he wasn't hurt. So I think it's only proven that he is maybe the best player in the world because the best team in the world can't win without him. So,
Well,
and it,
I've got a question for you, John.
yeah,
Do players make teams, or can you coach players to make teams?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking. Say that again.
So, for example, like I mean, with this problem with Rodri,
Yeah.
you transfer someone in, big money to fill that gap, or do you coach someone to try and play like him in the short term?
Phew. Well, I mean, again, if he's the best player in the world, or if Messi's was the best player in the world, you can't buy Messi, right? And I think I think certainly in team sports, there's been this trend towards the team and the system, whereas you just plug in next man up because
Mm,
the system is what wins, right? Whereas certainly 20 years ago was more about the players. Like you had the Platini, well, that's more than 20, right? You had the Zidane, you had this, and you just you built something that allowed the special player to do something special, Maradona, whatever. And now it's so much about tactics and systems that you'd like to think, yes, I can plug in another thing. But I think we see with Man City, there is no like for like switch. There is no plug in that makes that whole thing tick. And then you lose a couple games, and then it goes back to the psychology where you lose belief, right? Mike Tyson, the boxer, used to walk in and he already won most of his matches, right? But as soon as he loses, it's like, wait a second, I could be Mike Tyson, right? So now it's like people showing up going, you know, Man City, it's beatable. Man United, it's not, Old Trafford's not that scary a place to go anymore, you know? So,
it's simple because I think, are, are we getting to a point where we're overcoaching? Like, is a system too much? Are we taking the flair out of it? I mean, for me personally, I didn't particularly rely on too many. Always encourage my riders to build on their instinct in
mhm.
terms of if I try and overcoach something, it gets too complicated and there's too many permutations and combinations. I understand you have to give a structure or an idea, but are we just too lost in the ways of what we call philosophies and systems where actually, just whoever you've got is whoever you've got and to make the most out of it and by putting them in the right spots and letting them do their thing.
Yeah. Last week on the podcast, we had a guy, Eamon Devlin, who's done his PhD on halftime talks. And what is the ideal when you have that break at halftime or between periods? How much time do the players need to, fluids and nutrition and figure out stuff on their own and relax and whatever versus and then how much information can a coach give in that moment? And he's got some really interesting research in that space, and he's being hired all over the world with big teams of how do we maximize that moment. But really, in some of his research, when they interview these athletes, you know, what did the coach say at halftime? People are like, no, I have no idea. Right? It's gone. Right. So we as coaches, we go in thinking we just gave this brilliant thing that's going to fix it all, and they have no idea what we just what we just said.
Well, if you think about even like things with like very famous football games, the halftime tip, no one really remembers either. Like, with the when Liverpool beat AC Milan in the European Cup final
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
2004, a lot of the stories come out. The only people remember is that Rafa Benitez
It's Rafa.
subbed someone off, like because he said the word shower because he didn't know what the word substitute was in English at the time.
Yeah,
And they were like, "Oh, this team looks really good on the board," to the point where someone realized there was 12 rather than 11 players. So,
yeah,
the greatest comeback of all time, that's the thing they remember.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
yeah. So it's I'm not surprised. Like, when all your blood's going to your muscles, you're probably doing some kind of decompression in terms of trying to figure out what that or process what that half was for you. If that guy's kicking your ass, or you're giving him a good shooing as well. And then yeah, I mean, is it any and you have to caffeine up, so you're on edge again.
yeah,
I think you can. I mean,
yeah.
I'd be interested to know. Look more into that data.
Well, it's interesting. Like we said in professional soccer, right? The slowest sprint speeds of the game are the 10 minutes after halftime, right?
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, you would never expect that.
No, exactly. So that physical, reset is important right before you step out, as well as the emotional and whatever. And then you just said, when they film these half times and everything as well, and it's like, as soon as the coach walks in, people stop drinking, they stop eating, they stop talking. Right. So you as a coach have to make yourself distant if you want your players to refuel, right?
Yeah.
It's just fascinating, that again, this might be a marginal gain back to that, but that might be a big one. That might be one of the big pieces that has a 10% effect and not a 0.01% effect. So
Or getting back to that what you said earlier, less is more,
less
or
is
doing less
more.
with more.
And that's an area that you should pay attention to. What you say, how you say it, when you say it, how you use that time. So yeah, man, this was great. One last thing that I loved, and you said this on your podcast with Dan Abrahams that I really loved, is how we have to look when we're coaching, that we're not rewarding performance, we're rewarding behaviors. And this is one of the things that I am always striving to teach coaches at the grassroots level is that your focus should be on behaviors much more so than outcomes or the performance, because the right behaviors repeated over time are very likely to generate performance, whereas a focus on performance is not. So
Yeah,
just get your thoughts on that.
I think that it's easy, and I've been there as well for a coach to just be like, we reward performance because that's the thing that ultimately gets you results, happiness, joy, whatever you want to call it, success to the next level, or keeping a
Hmm.
job. But I think to have sustainability, you've got to like reward behaviors and maybe sort of look at rewarding performances a little bit less. And the reason why I say that is number one, it causes a split in the team. If you're if you're a squad or a team and you have a high performer who is doing really well, or the coach thinks he's doing really well, and therefore can turn up late, can take liberties, can start turning up for the bus late. It only goes so far when the coach keeps going, oh, but this guy's winning us games, we're doing really well, we can do what he wants. Because what that's saying is one of two things. Number one, if you hit a threshold, you can start acting how you want. You're still the same person. You can just, you can cycle a bike a bit faster or kick a ball a bit harder or whatever it might be. And the second thing as well is that what it's saying is like he doesn't value you until you start performing, which, some people can say that can be a motivator, but also it's just basically a every man or woman for themselves mentality when actually if he goes, like, I'm going to reward the person, who turns up on time, who engages most, who um, who arrives early, who's organized. I'm going to give them my resources and time. Then it
Hmm.
just sets a tone, and that you are willing to do it. One thing I would say is, you can't be the morality police in the short term. Like, you need a job, so
Yeah.
ultimately you have to win in the first instance. But when you start getting that stability, is when you can really install those things because, ultimately, I always say that there's kind of a well, this is my armchair psychology here, John. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not a psychologist by any sense, but when you're a startup, everything is going well if it's progression. Like, we're mucking in together, it's all good. We're a new team, it's a new identity, whatever you want to call it. And then you start doing well, if you're still surviving because you're punching above your weight, you're way ahead of expectations, and it's all going really well because everyone's mucking in, no one matters. And then the expectation sets in, or
Hmm.
success, which
Hmm.
breeds more expectation, where egos clash, where people start going, it wasn't as good as it was before. I'm not doing that. I'm more important. And then, so the real true, the identity, or the culture, and how you treat behaviors is really unraveled and revealed when you get successful or when you start having expectations. And that's when you really see the true innate identity of the team, and then how the coach deals with that and the team deal with that is also shown, like, in that. So I never say judge a team for punching above their weight, because they're not expected to win. Is when the
Hmm.
expectation sets in, the success comes in, and people start valuing themselves more. Is when you really see kind of how a culture is, um, fostered and changes if it needs to or does.
Yeah. Well, when you win, it's very easy for entitlement to creep in. And when there's
Mm.
entitlement in your locker room, it's very unlikely that you're going to win again. And again, this is the role of coach, is to have those relationships and those conversations of like, these are the behaviors that got you to this. These are the behaviors we're seeing now. If you want to get back to this, we need to behave that way. Plus, when we won, everyone's trying to do what we did. So we actually have to be better to win again. You know?
It's true, but also as well, I think when you win, and let's just say you're completely reliant on a player or a rider, which
Yeah.
is normally the case. It's great the first time. Like, we overcame the mountain, we climbed the mountain, we did it, guys, we did it. You win the second time, and and there's a disproportionate workload, let's just say, or lifting. Um, and then it's like, okay, this is good, but there's still some weak links here who are not pulling their weight. And then the third time is like, come on, guys, I'm doing everything. Where are these other guys, helping
Yeah.
me out? So it's the so again, I go back to the social dynamic of the team, particularly is revealed, when you have success. And I think the job of a coach is to make sure that, if you have weak links, if the heavy lifting is disproportionate amongst the team of riders or whatever, that you try and build everyone up to the same level as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Or refresh your team. Right?
Yeah, but
Which,
unfortunately, as a national coach, I can't do
yeah, as
that.
a national coach, it's much harder to do than as a club coach or whatever. But yeah, no, it's a hard thing. Well, Mehdi, this was a wonderful conversation, covered so many places for us. Congratulations on all you've done and the success of the Dutch, and now working with Ineos and whatever holds you next, whatever you're going to next. This was a fascinating conversation. Truly appreciate you being on the Way of Champions. Any final thought, and then also how can people connect with you and follow your work?
Final thoughts is just, thank you very much for your time. I enjoyed the conversation. If people want to connect with me, they can follow me on Instagram. It's Mehdi Kordi. It's MEHDIKORDI 11 is my handle, I think it's called. It's Mehdi Kordi on Twitter, or X as it's called now. LinkedIn, I do some posts there, some thought leadership, and also you can visit my website on medikordi.com.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, this was wonderful, man. I really appreciate it. Final thought for our listeners.
Um, you've
Covered a
stumped me
lot of
there.
ground. I mean, you left it at a great place. So
Yeah, let's leave it at a great place
let's
then.
leave it at a great place with that
But you know
behaviors
what?
as
But any
performance.
listeners, just sport is there to be enjoyed. So don't always get too wrapped into it.
Man, that's a whole nother conversation right there about the purpose, about the role of enjoyment in performances as well. That
This
we
time next year, John, if you'd have
That's
me
next
again.
year. Next year, awesome. Thanks for being on the Way of Champions.
Appreciate it, John. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for listening. Thanks again to Mehdi Kordi, medikordi.com. Me you just his name. Or and then Mehdi Kordi 11 on Instagram. Um, just a great conversation. We haven't had cycling coaches on here, but I just love this idea of focusing on performance, versus focusing on getting the behaviors right. I love this idea of, um, are marginal gains dead? Or if you have an unlimited budget, of course, you can focus on every little thing. But if you don't, well, what are the big things that you can focus on that are going to help you really, have the greatest gains as well? So, Olympic and world champion coach, tons to learn from him. And clearly, as you can see, a great guy as well. So, thank you for listening. Thanks again to our friends at Sprocket Sports. Thanks again to all of our Patreon podcast champions who support this podcast. And thank you for everyone listening here today. If you like this, please share it with someone. Please leave us a review. It's super, super helpful. But just tell people about the podcast. Okay. That's the best way you can say thank you for all this. And then go out and use your influence for good this week. Remember, it's not neutral. So go out there, use it for good, make a difference. We'll see you again next week, everyone.